Worldbuilding Workshop, Ask Me Anything, from Of Gods and Game Masters. Welcome back, my friends, to the fun that never ends. We are world building for modern games today, super and supernatural cities. We are going to be talking about backgrounds and history and tuning your supernatural or superheroic or supervillainous entities to the city. We're going to talk about the basics of city design for any purpose and how that changes when you are dealing with a real city, or at the very least, a city in the modern world. There are a few different things that we're going to cover in that regard. We'll see how much we can get through. Cityscape. Cityscape. I'm living it good, Davius. Big Nate, nice to see you. I have the Cityscape supplement for 3.5. I have all kinds of city supplements that I've gone through and paired together for a lot of the things that I'm covering today. What I have up on screen for you is my generic settlement form that I can use in literally any setting, any genre, any game. And what I did is I went through a whole lot of tabletop role-playing game supplements all over the place and found all the things that I thought needed to be in a settlement entry that aren't always present. A lot of the time they're very, very under-detailed, right? So I put together what I felt were the most critical ones into this form, and here we go. So starting from the rip with cities in general, and I'll do another installment at some point on fantasy cities and then another one on science fiction cities down the road. But in general, you obviously want the name for your city. If it's a real world city, cool, that's easy. Settlement size. Is it a hamlet, a thorpe? Thorpes are even smaller than hamlets, by the way. A thorpe, a hamlet, a village, a town, or a city, right? And you need to stick to a pretty clear vision of what that actually means. A lot of people use different definitions. Make clear what your definition is. Megalopolis. Yeah, you do have, of course, above city you have metropolis, and you're not wrong, megalopolis, which is basically the urban sprawls of like the cyberpunk setting, right? I have settlement alignment, which if you were doing it in like Dungeons and Dragons, any of the editions, you can put, chaotic evil, lawful evil, whatever. But it's generally a good idea to have just an overall feeling of whether that settlement is law-abiding or villainous or mostly vicious. And the settlement alignment generally refers to the populace, not necessarily the government, right? Yeah, absolutely. You've got to know the population base, how big it is, what the infrastructure is for handling it, et cetera, whether they have sewer systems, if those sewer systems are big enough to move around in like they are in some places in the world, but they certainly aren't in like Jacksonville, Florida, where I am. Now, you can always change that, but it's for your world, for your game setting, but understand the way they're set up and why. And the sewer system doesn't just come from the isn't just worrisome for the or underworld or whatever. You also have to think about, did the local and it's not just infrastructure, you have to think, did the local terrain allow for underground sewers, for instance? Is the water table too high? So all they have are some pipes running it off to the place where it gets treated and then released, rather than gigantic pipes you can move through because the water table was too high and it was too dangerous. Certainly things to keep in mind. Thanks for mentioning that, Big Nate. All right, so Down below that, right up top, we have authorities. Who's in charge of the city? And most of the time, what you're looking at there is who's officially in charge of the city. But you will want to note if the real power structure is different than the supposed power structure. If there is, for instance, a mayor and a town council with aldermen and etc., but the real power in the city is somewhere else, say in, right, Mayor Bob, Secretary Susie, but if the real power is somewhere else, in the power behind the throne, or it's actually fully ruled by the local crime syndicate or whatever, that's definitely something you'll want to note there. Commerce. What kind of business goes on and why? What do they do to make money or move money or, whatever? What commerce actually goes on in the city? Demographics and population. This is where you get to actually say, okay, there's literally this many people in the city. In a fantasy game like D&D or whatever, you need to put the percentage of the population that's elf or dwarf or halfling or three-eared rabbit people, right? Same thing with science fiction. You need to put the percentages that are human, space Mongols, Klingons, Ferengi, whatever. In a superhero game or a modern game, what you're putting in that area is more standard what people actually live there. You look at the demographics line in a city's Wikipedia page or a city's official government page, and you put in the percentages of various ethnicities and national origins and things like that, just to give an idea of what the city looks like when you're moving through it, right? A city like my one I'm going to use for an example here is my city of Barrow, Massachusetts, which is a fictional city, so I've had to do all of the world building from the bottom. Not really to share all of it yet, but a city like that, or a city like Boston, that has a really large Portuguese population and a decent Middle Eastern population, but relatively Spanish, relatively low Spanish, right? That's very different than cities that have a different population. Absolutely. Very, very often you're going to have specific boroughs or neighborhoods for their residential areas, right? I definitely have that in Barrow. And it's definitely something to keep in mind. When it comes to aliens, it may not be different, right? You may actually have, in a futuristic world or setting, you may actually have, Klingon town in LA, or Ferengi town, or Wookiee town, or whatever. Sapient beings in general will likely tend to clump up into groups of people who share many things in common, especially culture and or religion, right? Like you'll actually get separate Orthodox Christian settlements from Catholic Christian settlements, although they might be right next to each other in the overall Albanian section, for instance. What do you want, Jake? It's Wookiee Town. Yeah. In some settings, you absolutely can use unconventional currency. Normally, your commerce section in a super/supernatural city isn't going to have that in it, because we're talking about the way the city looks above board right now. right? All of this that I'm taking you through now is what the city looks like to everyone. So if you're building a super city, especially in most cases, as we discussed last time, the world that it's in isn't going to be hugely different from the world that we're in, because most people don't want the world outside the window to be changed, right? In a supernatural setting, the secret currencies that everything runs on aren't going to be publicly known. So again, looking out your window, they're using dollars, they're using this, they're using that. In a futuristic setting, you can make a big point of saying what currency they currently use, and it tells you a lot about the world building. Like Euro dollars in Night City, in and all over the world in Cyberpunk 2020, Cyberpunk Red, and 2077, or New Yen in Shadowrun, right? It tells you a lot about the history in a snapshot. Exactly. We are definitely talking about modernish settings, because I've covered fantasy a lot, and we are really talking today primarily about super and supernatural cities in a modern context. You are correct. But when we go, and like I said, when we go far future, that's definitely going to be a different beast, because I have specific comments on that as well. So once you've got your demographics and population, what you have and what the percentages are like, then you look at what do they import. What does the city need that it cannot make itself, or that other people make better or less expensively, and thus they import it, right? Notable exports. What do they make in the city? What do they produce in the city? What can they get in the city for cheaper, and thus other cities and countries import it from them? It is possible in a modern setting to have a city that imports everything and has almost no exports, or simply acts as a trade hub and doesn't really have any exports of its own. It does not actually create things. A lot of American cities in modern day are in a situation where they create and export relatively little and deal in services and finances while the things are being made elsewhere. And that wasn't necessarily the smartest move long term for those companies, but they're making their money now. So you need to consider those things. Then you get into architecture. What does the architecture look like? What is the style of the architecture? When were the first buildings made? Are those buildings still standing? Correct. This is imports both above board and below. Absolutely. Although the below board is likely to be covered under the next section with this crime, it's still important to know very definitely what they import criminally, whether what illegal drugs they import, etc., etc. Architecture is important to the feel of a city. Old cities in Europe have buildings in them that are hundreds of years old. Some cities in the U.S. have a few buildings that are hundreds of years old. St. Augustine, Florida, for instance. Some parts of Boston are, a couple hundred years old. But the age and style of the architecture is very important. And whether it's a super modern city, and thus its downtown is all gleaming steel and skyscrapers, or the whole city is like that, like in the case of my fictional city built on an artificial man-made island called, in a super's context specifically, called Neapolis, which is purely bright and shining and super tall, right? because it was all built very recently. Yep, Nolens has some very old buildings in it as well. St. Augustine has buildings which have been around since the 1500s, by the way, and I live very close to that town. St. Augustine is the oldest contiguous European settlement in the United States, or in North America, I believe. It's actually predates Jamestown by quite a bit. It just was Spanish rather than English. Nolens is interesting because it has been held by the French, the Spanish, and the U.S. over time. Lots of interesting cultural blending in the Crescent City. I used to live outside of it. But another thing about architecture is that it's not just the age, right? It's also affected by the region it's in, by the culture it's in at the time that those buildings are built. The architecture of New York, Boston, Barrow are not only different from each other, they are even more different from architecture in Florida. And all of those are different than architecture in London, right? Obviously, I'm not talking about McDonald's and franchises and slap a house down, look like every other house type of architecture. I'm talking about the soul of the city architecture. In superheroic and supernatural cities, you are looking for an architectural description is so important because you're looking at the difference literally between Metropolis and Gotham, right? Between Hub City and Star City, between Marvel New York and Marvel Latveria. The architecture tells you a huge amount about the setting and very much sets the tone. If you want it to be Gothic, you want it to be dark and shadowed, then you've got a lot of old... Right. That too. Freedom City, absolutely. Those are all very different cities, right? You want to describe each of those cities in very specific ways. And if you want a city to feel Gothic like Gotham, then it's going to have more elevated trains. It's going to be more like a weird mixture visually of old New York combined with Boston and Chicago, which is what I did with Barrow. Whereas Metropolis, even though it's canonically in New Jersey, no, it's in Delaware, and Gotham is canonically in New Jersey. Metropolis is New York at its tallest, brightest, and shiniest, right? It's the parts of downtown New York, especially Manhattan, that are all shiny, super shiny skyscrapers. So your architecture will have a huge effect on the tone. And then once you have the architecture, you'll understand that it'll have a huge effect on the crime and the crime fighters. If you have a city that's mostly low to the ground, yeah, post-industrial Art Deco splendor, you're not wrong. If you have a city that's spread out and most of the buildings are low to the ground, a superhero like Spider-Man, thank you, Big Nate. A superhero like Spider-Man is not going to do as well in a setting where he doesn't have the ability to swing super high through all the buildings, right? Even if it's just as reasonable technically for a superhero character to get his power set elsewhere, it's not as useful elsewhere. Spider-Man is in many ways uniquely an urban hero, whereas Superman's powers work just about everywhere, even though he focuses on Metropolis, right? Um, Batman is very much focused on the urban hero. And the nature of his city very strongly determined the abilities he had to give himself and the way he fights crime. So that takes us from and architecture also determines some of the things about how crime happens in a city. If you have a lot of tall buildings and a lot of deep, dark alleys, then you've got places for crime to happen off the street, away from the cops. If you don't have a lot of alleys, if everything's super open plan, which some cities are, then crime has to happen out of sight. There's not as much street crime and muggings. There's still some, because of course you can always have somebody just run the heck by and do the grab and smash and grab, but that's less of the armed robbery and more of the just purse snatching. So the architecture has a lot to do with at least how the street crime operates, but it also to a certain extent has a bit to do with how some of the other crime operates, because you have, with wide open architecture and brightly lit streets, organized crime is much more careful to stay out of sight, and disorganized crime is less likely to really exist. The streets will be relatively peaceful. That doesn't mean the city will be crime-free, right? But it does mean the streets will be safer. And yes, Devious, Gotham architecture definitely equals industrial Gothic decay, just as the architecture of Gary, Indiana, just outside Chicago, and also parts of Chicago, and definitely Detroit nowadays, all fall into industrial Gothic decay. Detroit lost a huge number of its citizens, and there are whole wide swaths of Detroit that are actually nearly completely empty. And those areas are quite dangerous. Still not as dangerous as like East St. Louis in Illinois, which is right next to St. Louis in Missouri. It's some interesting stuff. But yeah, so the architecture influences the crime. And when we come to the crime itself, then you're going to want to think, okay, given the nature of the authorities, given the nature of the commerce, where the money is and how the money is made, and the imports and exports, what then are the obvious major crimes? What are the things that you've already seen from the imports and exports, etc., and the architecture? What does that suggest? Yeah, that's what I said. East St. Louis in Illinois. Right next to St. Louis. Did I not say that? Pretty certain I said that. They could absolutely intentionally plan buildings to make superheroes or heroes against supernatural villains weaker. They absolutely could. Did I say Missouri? Man, okay. All right, fair enough. Thanks for the catch. Yeah, no, I meant to say it was in Illinois. So, when you combine the architecture, imports, exports, authorities, and commerce, and the demographics and population, you then start to get a good idea of what the crime is likely to look like, right? If there's a huge number of Italian Americans in the city, then you are more likely to have La Cosa Nostra, Italian American Mafia. If it is a very high percentage of Irishmen in the city, then you're likely to have the Irish mob. If it's a high percentage of Japanese people, you've got the Yakuza. If it's a high percentage of Chinese people, you have the Tongs and the Triads. Koreans with the Soul Rings. Russians and Albanians bring in the Bratva, you know? I can't even. the Vori. Anyway, the Russian mafia. So you get an idea of what the organized crime is going to be like very often from the amount of various ethnicities that exist in the city and which ones they are. That is also how you start to get a look at what the street gangs are, because even more than the ethnic mafias, street gangs are usually both ethnic gang. Yes, you're right. There were some big Jewish mobs, especially in New York, but the Jewish mobsters were also involved in both the Italian mob work and the Irish mob work, and they crossed over quite a bit. But your gangs are going to be very often, even more ethnically focused, and then also on top of that, territorially focused. Most of your organized crime will be at least a little territorially focused, but they also might be more focused in, like, this organized crime group does this type of crime, ships in this kind of thing, back and forth, back and forth. Gangs defend their territory against other gangs, basically regardless of what's being moved or handled. Because many gangs didn't actually start out as criminal enterprises. They started out as neighborhood protection rackets and neighborhood protection groups that very quickly turned into organized crime. Which is interesting because with most ethnic organized crime, they actually started out in their original home countries as neighborhood watch and protection from abusive nobles and overlords. That's where the mafia came from. That's where the Yakuza came from. The Tongs and the Triads came from rebellion and resistance against tyrannical regimes originally as well. They all pretty much started that way, except the Russians, who started much less pleasantly. We're not going to get into that, but I am going to go and take a bathroom break while this thing runs a couple of ads. I'll be right back.